Chapter 2, Dred Scott versus Sandford, 1857. A Nation Divided. This chapter examines the infamous Dred Scott decision, which ruled that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. The case exacerbated tensions between the North and South, contributing to the onset of the Civil War, and highlighted the Supreme Court's role in perpetuating systemic racism. Chapter 3, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, Separate but Equal. This chapter discusses the case that upheld state laws requiring racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. It explores the rise of Jim Crow laws, the impact of the decision on African Americans, and the long road to its eventual overturning in Brown v. Board of Education. Chapter 4, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, The End of Legal Segregation. This chapter focuses on the landmark case that declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. It highlights the role of the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall's legal strategy, and the resistance to desegregation in the South, setting the stage for the Civil Rights Movement. Chapter 5, Miranda v. Arizona, 1966, The Right to Remain Silent. This chapter covers the case that established the Miranda rights, requiring law enforcement to inform suspects of their rights before interrogation. It explores the impact of the decision on criminal procedure, the balance between law enforcement and individual rights, and its enduring presence in popular culture. Chapter 6, Roe v. Wade, 1973. The Right to Privacy. This chapter delves into the controversial case that legalized abortion nationwide by recognizing a woman's right to privacy under the 14th Amendment. It examines the societal and political debates surrounding reproductive rights, the role of activism, and the ongoing legal battles over abortion access. Chapter 7, United States versus Nixon, 1974, The Limits of Executive Power. This chapter explores the case that forced President Richard Nixon to surrender the Watergate tapes, leading to his resignation. It highlights the Supreme Court's role in checking executive power, the importance of transparency in government, and the lasting impact on American politics. Chapter 8, Bush v. Gore, 2000, The Election That Hinged on the Court. This chapter examines the Supreme Court's intervention in the 2000 presidential election, which effectively decided the presidency in favor of George W. Bush. It discusses the legal and political controversies surrounding the case, the role of the judiciary in electoral disputes, and its implications for democracy. Chapter 9, Obergefell v. Hodges, 2015, Marriage Equality. This chapter covers the case that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, marking a historic victory for LGBTQ+ rights. It explores the decades-long struggle for marriage equality, the legal arguments for and against, and the societal changes that followed the decision. Chapter 10, Citizens United vs. FEC, 2010, Money in Politics. This chapter analyzes the case that ruled corporate funding of independent political broadcasts in candidate elections cannot be limited under the First Amendment. It discusses the rise of super PACs, the influence of money in politics, and the ongoing debate over campaign finance reform. Each chapter not only recounts the legal details of the case, but also provides historical context, explores the personal stories of those involved, and examines the broader societal impact of the court's decisions. The book concludes with reflections on the role of the Supreme Court in shaping American life and the ongoing challenges it faces in a rapidly changing world. Marbury vs. Madison, 1803, the birth of judicial review. The year was 1801, and the young United States was in the throes of a political revolution. The Federalists, led by outgoing President John Adams, were desperately clinging to power as the Democratic Republicans, under Thomas Jefferson, prepared to take control of the government. The air was thick with tension, and the fate of the nation's judiciary hung in the balance. It was the eve of Jefferson's inauguration, and the Federalists were scrambling to secure their legacy. In a last-ditch effort, Adams appointed a slew of loyal Federalists to judicial positions, including William Marbury as a justice of the peace in the District of Columbia. These appointments were confirmed by the Senate, and the commissions were signed and sealed. But not all of them were delivered before Adams left office. When Jefferson assumed the presidency, he was furious at the Federalists' attempt to pack the courts with their allies. He ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, to withhold the undelivered commissions, effectively blocking Marbury and others from taking office. Marbury, determined to claim his position, took his case to the Supreme Court, demanding a writ of mandamus to force Madison to deliver the commission. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown. The case landed on the desk of Chief Justice John Marshall, a staunch Federalist and Adams' former Secretary of State. Marshall faced an impossible dilemma. If he ruled in favor of Marbury, Jefferson and Madison might simply ignore the court's order, exposing its weakness. But if he ruled against Marbury, he would be surrendering to the Democratic Republicans and betraying his Federalist principles. As the court convened, the nation held its breath. Marshall's decision would not only determine Marbury's fate, but also define the role of the judiciary in American government. In a masterstroke of legal and political maneuvering, Marshall delivered a ruling that was both a victory and a defeat. He declared that Marbury was indeed entitled to his commission and that Madison's refusal to deliver it was unlawful. However, he also ruled that the Supreme Court did not have the authority to issue a writ of mandamus in this case, as the provision of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that granted such power was unconstitutional. The decision was a bombshell. By striking down part of an act of Congress, Marshall established the principle of judicial review. The idea that the Supreme Court has the power to interpret the Constitution and invalidate laws that conflict with it. It was a bold assertion of the court's authority, and it fundamentally reshaped the balance of power among the branches of government. But the drama didn't end there. Jefferson and his allies were outraged by Marshall's audacity, seeing it as a Federalist power grab. They accused the court of overstepping its bounds and threatened to undermine its authority. Meanwhile, Marbury never received his commission, and the case faded into obscurity, but its legacy endured. Marshall's ruling in Marbury versus Madison was a turning point in American history. It cemented the Supreme Court's role as the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution and laid the foundation for the judiciary's independence. Yet, it also sowed the seeds of future conflicts over the limits of judicial power and the tension between law and politics. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. The Supreme Court had emerged as a formidable force in American governance, and the story of Marbury versus Madison would be remembered as the moment when the judiciary found its voice. But the battle over its role and authority was far from over, and the echoes of this landmark case would reverberate for centuries to come. The suspense of that fateful decision, the political intrigue, the personal stakes, and the high stakes gamble would forever mark Marbury versus Madison as one of the most pivotal moments in the history of the United States. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how far would the power of judicial review extend, and who would ultimately hold the reins of constitutional interpretation? Dred Scott versus Sandford, 1857. A nation divided. The year was 1857, and the United States was a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The issue of slavery had torn the country apart, pitting North against South, abolitionists against slaveholders, and freedom against oppression. Into this maelstrom stepped Dred Scott, an enslaved man whose quest for freedom would ignite a legal and political firestorm that would forever change the course of American history. Dred Scott's story began in the early 1830s when he was enslaved by Dr. John Emerson, an army surgeon stationed in Missouri, a slave state. Over the years, Emerson's military career took him and Scott to free territories, including Illinois and Wisconsin. During this time, Scott met and married Harriet Robinson, an enslaved woman, and they started a family. In 1846, after returning to Missouri, Scott made a bold decision. He would sue for his freedom. His argument was simple, yet revolutionary. By living in free territories, he claimed, he and his family had been emancipated under the principle of once free, always free. With the help of abolitionist lawyers, Scott filed suit against Irene Emerson, Dr. Emerson's widow, who now owned him. The case wound its way through the Missouri courts, with Scott winning and losing at different stages. But in 1852, the Missouri Supreme Court dealt him a devastating blow, ruling against him and declaring that his time in free territories did not change his status as a slave. Undeterred, Scott's lawyers took the case to federal court, where it eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The stakes could not have been higher. The nation was deeply divided over the issue of slavery, and the court's decision had the potential to either diffuse the tension or inflame it further. The justices, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a staunch supporter of slavery, knew that their ruling would have far-reaching consequences. As the court deliberated, the nation held its breath. The case had become a flashpoint in the national debate over slavery, with abolitionists and slaveholders alike watching closely. The question before the court was not just about Dred Scott's freedom, but about the future of slavery in America. On March 6, 1857, the court delivered its decision, a ruling that would send shockwaves across the country. In a 7-2 decision, the court ruled against Scott, declaring that he had no right to sue because as an African American, he was not a citizen of the United States. But the court went even further, Chief Justice Taney, writing for the majority, declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were beings of an inferior order who had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. He also ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively invalidating the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and opening the door to the expansion of slavery into new territories. The decision was a crushing blow to Dred Scott and his family, who remained enslaved, but its impact extended far beyond their personal tragedy. The ruling inflamed tensions between the North and South, emboldening pro-slavery forces and enraging abolitionists. It also deepened the divide within the Democratic Party and helped galvanize the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. In the North, the decision was met with outrage. Newspapers condemned the court, and public figures like Abraham Lincoln denounced it as a moral and legal travesty. In the South, however, the ruling was celebrated as a victory for states' rights and the institution of slavery. The fallout from Dred Scott vs. Sandford was immediate and profound. It shattered any hope of a peaceful resolution to the slavery question and set the stage for the Civil War. The case also marked a low point for the Supreme Court, whose reputation was tarnished by its blatant partisanship and moral failure. For Dred Scott, the story ended in bittersweet fashion. Shortly after the ruling, he and his family were emancipated by their new owner, Peter Blow. But Scott's freedom was short-lived. He died of tuberculosis just over a year later. The legacy of Dred Scott vs. Sandford is one of infamy. It stands as a stark reminder of the Supreme Court's capacity to perpetuate injustice and the enduring struggle for equality in America. The case also underscores the profound impact that the judiciary can have on the nation's moral and political fabric. As the country descended into civil war, the echoes of the Dred Scott decision reverberated across the land. It was a grim testament to the power of the law to shape the course of history, and a sobering reminder of the cost of failing to uphold justice and equality for all. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes, and the nation's collective anxiety would forever mark Dred Scott versus Sandford as one of the most consequential and controversial cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the wounds inflicted by this decision be healed? And what would it take to build a more just and equitable society? Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Separate but equal. The year was 1892, and the city of New Orleans was a vibrant, bustling hub of culture and commerce. But beneath its lively surface, the city and the nation was grappling with the bitter legacy of slavery and the rise of Jim Crow laws designed to enforce racial segregation. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Homer Plessy, a man whose act of defiance would spark a legal battle that would shape the course of American history. Homer Plessy was a shoemaker of mixed racial heritage, with light skin that allowed him to pass as white. But Plessy was deeply committed to the cause of racial equality, and he had agreed to be the face of a carefully orchestrated challenge to Louisiana's Separate Car Act, which required equal but separate accommodations for white and black passengers on trains. On June 7, 1892, Plessy boarded a whites-only train car and took his seat. When the conductor asked if he was white, Plessy admitted that he was not. He was promptly arrested and charged with violating the law. The case was no accident. It had been planned by the Citizens Committee, a group of black activists and lawyers who sought to challenge the constitutionality of segregation laws. The case made its way through the Louisiana courts, with Plessy's lawyers arguing that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments, which abolished slavery and guaranteed equal protection under the law. But the state courts upheld the law, and the case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The stakes were enormous. The court's decision would determine whether racial segregation was permissible under the Constitution, and its ruling would have far-reaching implications for the future of civil rights in America. The nation watched with bated breath as the Obergefell justices prepared to weigh in on one of the most contentious issues of the day. On May 18, 1896, the court delivered its decision, a ruling that would cement the doctrine of separate but equal into American law for decades to come. In a 7-1 decision, the court upheld Louisiana's segregation law, with Justice Henry Billings Brown writing for the majority. Brown argued that the 14th Amendment guaranteed political equality, but not social equality. He famously declared that legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. The court's ruling gave legal sanction to segregation, provided that the facilities for black and white people were equal, a condition that was rarely, if ever, met in practice. The lone dissenter, Justice John Marshall Harlan, delivered a blistering critique of the majority's decision. In his now iconic dissent, Harlan declared, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." He warned that the ruling would unleash a wave of oppressive laws and deepen racial divisions in the country. The impact of Plessy versus Ferguson was immediate and devastating. The decision emboldened states across the South to enact even more stringent segregation laws, codifying racial discrimination in nearly every aspect of public life, from schools and restaurants to hospitals and public transportation. Black Americans were relegated to inferior facilities and treated as second-class citizens. For Homer Plessy, the case was a personal defeat. He pleaded guilty to the charge and paid a $25 fine. But his act of defiance had far-reaching consequences. The case became a rallying cry for the civil rights movement, inspiring generations of activists to fight against segregation and inequality. The legacy of Plessy versus Ferguson is one of infamy. It stands as a stark reminder of the Supreme Court's capacity to uphold injustice and the enduring struggle for racial equality in America. The case also underscores the profound impact that the judiciary can have on the nation's moral and political fabric. It would take nearly 6 decades for the court to overturn the separate but equal doctrine in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. But the damage inflicted by Plessy would linger for much longer. The case remains a symbol of the long and difficult road toward justice and equality in America. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes, and the nation's collective anxiety would forever mark Plessy v. Ferguson as one of the most consequential and controversial cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the wounds inflicted by this decision be healed, and what would it take to build a more just and equitable society? The answer would come at a tremendous cost, written in the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better future. Brown vs. Board of Education, 1954, the end of legal segregation. The year was 1951, and the United States was a nation deeply divided by race. In the South, Jim Crow laws enforced strict segregation, relegating Black Americans to second-class citizenship. Schools, restaurants, buses, and even drinking fountains were labeled white and colored, a constant reminder of the systemic inequality that permeated every aspect of life. But in the small town of Topeka, Kansas, a group of parents decided to take a stand. Their fight would lead to one of the most monumental Supreme Court cases in American history. Brown versus Board of Education. At the heart of the case was Linda Brown, a young Black girl who was denied admission to an all-white elementary school just a few blocks from her home. Instead, she was forced to walk miles to a segregated Black school, crossing railroad tracks and waiting in the cold for a bus. Her father, Oliver Brown, was determined to give his daughter a better future. Alongside 12 other families, he joined a lawsuit organized by the NAACP to challenge the constitutionality of school segregation. The case was part of a broader strategy by the NAACP to dismantle the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Led by Thurgood Marshall, the organization's chief legal counsel, the NAACP argued that segregated schools were inherently unequal, inflicting psychological harm on Black children and perpetuating a system of racial inferiority. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, where it was consolidated with 4 other cases from Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The stakes were enormous. The court's decision would determine whether racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law. As the justices deliberated, the nation held its breath. The case had become a flashpoint in the national debate over civil rights, with segregationists and activists alike watching closely. The question before the court was not just about education, but about the future of race relations in America. On May 17, 1954, the Ada Court delivered its unanimous decision, a ruling that would change the course of American history. Chief Justice Earl Warren, writing for the court, declared that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. He argued that segregated schools were inherently unequal, inflicting psychological harm on Black children and depriving them of equal educational opportunities. The decision was a seismic shift in American law and society. It struck down the legal foundation of segregation and marked the beginning of the end for Jim Crow. But the ruling was met with fierce resistance, particularly in the South. Many states refused to comply, and some even shut down public schools rather than integrate them. The backlash was swift and violent in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students, known as the Little Rock Nine, faced angry mobs and National Guard troops when they attempted to enroll in a previously all-white high school. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was forced to send federal troops to escort the students to class, a dramatic reminder of the federal government's role in enforcing the court's decision. For Linda Brown and her family, the case was a personal victory, but the fight was far from over. The Browns faced harassment and threats, and Linda's father, Oliver, became a symbol of the struggle for civil rights. The case also catapulted Thurgood Marshall to national prominence, paving the way for his historic appointment as the first Black Supreme Court Justice. The legacy of Brown vs. Board of Education is profound. It marked the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, inspiring activists to challenge segregation and inequality in all areas of life. The case also underscored the Supreme Court's role as a protector of individual rights and a catalyst for social change. But the promise of Brown remains unfulfilled. Decades after the ruling, many schools remain deeply segregated, a testament to the enduring legacy of racism and inequality in America. The case serves as a reminder of the long and difficult road toward justice and equality, and the ongoing struggle to build a more just and equitable society. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes, and the nation's collective anxiety would forever mark Brown vs. Board of Education as one of the most consequential and transformative cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the wounds inflicted by segregation be healed? And what would it take to fulfill the promise of equality for all? The answer would come at a tremendous cost, written in the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better future. Miranda vs. Arizona, 1966, the right to remain silent. The year was 1963, and the city of Phoenix, Arizona, was a bustling desert metropolis. But beneath its sunny exterior, a storm was brewing, one that would forever change the relationship between law enforcement and the accused. At the center of this storm was Ernesto Miranda, a man whose name would become synonymous with one of the most famous legal phrases in American history: "You have the right to remain silent." Ernesto Miranda was a 23-year-old laborer with a troubled past. On March 13, 1963, he was arrested by Phoenix police and taken to the station for questioning in connection with the kidnapping and rape of an 18-year-old woman. Miranda was no stranger to the criminal justice system, having served time for burglary and other offenses. But this time, the stakes were much higher. For hours, Miranda was interrogated in a small, windowless room. The police did not inform him of his right to an attorney or his right against self-incrimination. Under intense pressure, Miranda confessed to the crime and signed a written statement. That statement would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against him. Miranda was convicted and sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison, but his case was far from over. With the help of his court-appointed attorney, Alvin Moore, Miranda appealed his conviction, arguing that his confession had been coerced and that he had not been informed of his constitutional rights. The case made its way to the Arizona Supreme Court, which upheld Miranda's conviction, but Moore, undeterred, took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, where it was consolidated with 3 other cases involving similar issues of police interrogation and self-incrimination. The stage was set for a landmark decision that would redefine the rights of the accused. As the Supreme Court prepared to hear the case, the nation watched with bated breath. The question before the court was clear. Did the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination and the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel require law enforcement to inform suspects of their rights before interrogation? The answer would have profound implications for the criminal justice system and the balance of power between police and citizens. On June 13, 1966, the court delivered its decision, a ruling that would transform the way police conducted interrogations and secured confessions. In a 5-4 decision, Chief Justice Earl Warren, writing for the majority, declared that the Fifth and Sixth Amendments required law enforcement to inform suspects of their rights before questioning. These rights, now known as the Miranda rights, include the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, and the warning that anything they say can be used against them in court. The decision was a bombshell. Law enforcement agencies across the country were outraged, arguing that the ruling would handcuff police and make it harder to solve crimes. Civil libertarians, on the other hand, hailed the decision as a victory for individual rights and a necessary check on police power. For Ernesto Miranda, the ruling was a mixed blessing. His conviction was overturned, and he was retried without the use of his confession. This time, he was convicted again and sentenced to prison. After serving his sentence, Miranda became a minor celebrity, selling autographed Miranda warning cards for a few dollars each. But his life took a tragic turn in 1976 when he was stabbed to death in a bar fight. Ironically, the suspect in his murder invoked his Miranda rights and refused to speak to police. The legacy of Miranda versus Arizona is profound. The case established a critical safeguard for the rights of the accused, ensuring that suspects are aware of their constitutional protections before they are interrogated. The Miranda warning has become a staple of American popular culture, recited in countless movies and TV shows. But the case also sparked ongoing debates about the balance between law enforcement and individual rights. Critics argue that the Miranda warning has made it harder for police to solve crimes, while supporters contend that it is a necessary protection against coercion and abuse. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes, and the nation's collective anxiety would forever mark Miranda versus Arizona as one of the most consequential and controversial cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the rights of the accused be balanced with the needs of law enforcement? And what would it take to ensure justice for all? The answer would come at a tremendous cost, written in the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better future. Roe v. Wade, 1973, the right to privacy. The year was 1970, and the United States was a nation in turmoil. The feminist movement was gaining momentum, demanding equality and autonomy for women. At the same time, the country was deeply divided over the issue of abortion, with passionate arguments on both sides. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Norma McCorvey, a young woman whose legal challenge would forever change the landscape of reproductive rights in America. Norma McCorvey, using the pseudonym Jane Roe, was a 22-year-old single mother living in Texas. Pregnant for the third time, she sought an abortion, but Texas law prohibited the procedure, except to save the life of the mother. Desperate and with few options, McCorvey was connected with two young lawyers, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, who were looking for a plaintiff to challenge the state's restrictive abortion laws. The case, filed in federal court, argued that Texas's abortion ban violated McCorvey's constitutional rights, including her right to privacy. The district court ruled in her favor, but the state appealed, and the case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. As the court prepared to hear the case, the nation watched with bated breath. The question before the justices was clear. Did the Constitution protect a woman's right to choose to have an abortion? The answer would have profound implications for women's rights, medical practice, and the ongoing debate over the beginning of life. The Supreme Court heard arguments in Roe v. Wade in December 1971, but the justices were deeply divided. They scheduled a second round of arguments in October 1972, giving both sides another opportunity to present their cases. The stakes were enormous, and the tension was palpable. On January 22, 1973, the court delivered its decision, a ruling that would ignite a firestorm of controversy and reshape American society. In a 7-2 decision, the court held that the Constitution protects a woman's right to choose to have an abortion, grounded in the right to privacy implied by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Justice Harry Blackmun, writing for the majority, outlined a framework that balanced a woman's right to privacy with the state's interest in regulating abortion. The court divided pregnancy into 3 trimesters, ruling that during the first trimester, the decision to have an abortion was solely between a woman and her doctor. In the second trimester, the state could regulate abortion to protect the mother's health, and in the third trimester, the state could prohibit abortion except when necessary to save the mother's life. The decision was a landmark victory for the feminist movement and reproductive rights advocates. It struck down restrictive abortion laws in 46 states and established a woman's right to choose as a fundamental constitutional right. But the ruling also sparked fierce opposition, galvanizing the pro-life movement and setting the stage for decades of legal and political battles. For Norma McCorvey, the case was a personal and complicated journey. After the ruling, she became a public figure, advocating for abortion rights. But in the 1990s, she underwent a dramatic transformation, becoming a born-again Christian and a vocal opponent of abortion. Her story remains a poignant reminder of the deeply personal and often painful nature of the abortion debate. The legacy of Roe v. Wade is profound and enduring. The case established a woman's right to choose as a fundamental constitutional right, empowering millions of women to make decisions about their own bodies and lives. But it also ignited a cultural and political firestorm, with opponents working tirelessly to overturn or undermine the decision. In the decades since Roe, the battle over abortion rights has only intensified. States have passed hundreds of laws restricting access to abortion, and the issue has become a litmus test for political candidates and judicial nominees. The Supreme Court itself has revisited the issue multiple times, most notably in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, 1992, which reaffirmed the core holding of Roe, but allowed states to impose restrictions as long as they did not place an undue burden on a woman's right to choose. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes, and the nation's collective anxiety would forever mark Roe v. Wade as one of the most consequential and controversial cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the rights of women be balanced with the moral and ethical concerns surrounding abortion? And what would it take to ensure justice and autonomy for all? The answer would come at a tremendous cost, written in the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better future. United States versus Nixon, 1974. The limits of executive power. The year was 1974, and the United States was in the grip of a constitutional crisis. The Watergate scandal had shaken the nation to its core, exposing a web of corruption, deceit, and abuse of power at the highest levels of government. At the center of the storm was President Richard Nixon, whose actions would lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations between the executive branch and the judiciary in American history. The scandal began in June 1972, when 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a trail of illegal activities, including wiretapping, sabotage, and hush money, all orchestrated by Nixon's re-election campaign and covered up by the White House. By 1973, the scandal had engulfed the Nixon administration. Congressional hearings, televised live across the nation, revealed shocking details of the cover-up and raised serious questions about the president's involvement. Nixon denied any wrongdoing, but the evidence against him continued to mount. The turning point came in July 1973, when it was revealed that Nixon had secretly recorded all conversations in the Oval Office. These tapes, investigators believed, contained the smoking gun that would prove the president's complicity in the cover-up. But Nixon refused to hand over the tapes, citing executive privilege and the need to protect national security. The battle over the tapes reached a climax in April 1974, when Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski subpoenaed 64 tapes as part of the ongoing Watergate investigation. Nixon again refused to comply, setting the stage for a historic legal showdown. The case, United States versus Nixon, made its way to the Supreme Court, where the justices would have to decide whether the president was above the law. As the court prepared to hear the case, the nation held its breath. The question before the justices was clear. Did the president's claim of executive privilege allow him to withhold evidence in a criminal investigation? The answer would have profound implications for the balance of power between the branches of government and the rule of law. The Supreme Court heard arguments on July 8, 1974. The atmosphere was tense, with the future of the presidency hanging in the balance. Nixon's legal team argued that the president had an absolute right to executive privilege, while Jaworski contended that no one, not even the president, was above the law. On July 24, 1974, the court delivered its unanimous decision, a ruling that would mark a turning point in American history. Chief Justice Warren Burger, writing for the court, declared that while the president does have a legitimate need for confidentiality, it is not absolute. The court held that the need for evidence in a criminal trial outweighed the president's claim of executive privilege and ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes. The decision was a devastating blow to Nixon. Within weeks, the tapes were released, revealing incontrovertible evidence of the president's involvement in the Watergate cover-up, facing almost certain impeachment by the House of Representatives and conviction by the Senate. Nixon announced his resignation on August 8, 1974, becoming the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. The legacy of United States versus Nixon is profound. The case reaffirmed the principle that no one, not even the president, is above the law. It also underscored the importance of checks and balances in the American system of government, demonstrating that the judiciary has the power to hold the executive branch accountable. But the case also left lingering questions about the limits of executive power and the role of the judiciary in policing the other branches of government. In the decades since United States versus Nixon, presidents have continued to assert claims of executive privilege, often leading to contentious legal battles. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes, and the UEU nation's collective anxiety would forever mark United States versus Nixon as one of the most consequential and dramatic cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the balance of power between the branches of government be maintained? And what would it take to ensure accountability and justice for all? The answer would come at a tremendous cost, written in the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better future. Bush vs. Gore, 2000. The election that hinged on the court. The year was 2000, and the United States was on the edge of a political precipice. The presidential election between Republican George W. Bush and Democrat Al Gore had come down to a razor-thin margin in the state of Florida. The outcome of the election and the future of the nation hung in the balance. What followed was a 36-day legal and political battle that would culminate in one of the most controversial The drama began on election night, November 7th, 2000. As the results poured in, it became clear that Florida's 25 electoral votes would determine the next president. The initial count showed Bush leading by a mere 1,184 votes out of nearly 6 million cast, a margin so slim that it triggered an automatic machine recount under Florida law. But the recount only deepened the uncertainty. Reports of irregularities, confusing ballot designs, and the infamous hanging chads on punch card ballots fueled calls for a manual recount in several heavily Democratic counties. The Gore campaign believed that a hand recount would reveal thousands of uncounted votes, potentially tipping the election in their favor. The Bush campaign, meanwhile, argued that the recounts were inconsistent and unconstitutional, and they sought to stop them. The legal battles began almost immediately. Both sides filed lawsuits, and the case quickly made its way through the Florida courts. On November 21st, the Florida Supreme Court ruled in favor of Gore, ordering a statewide manual recount. The Bush campaign appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which temporarily halted the recount and agreed to hear the case. The nation held its breath as the Supreme Court prepared to weigh in. The question before the justices was clear. Did the Florida Supreme Court's decision to order a manual recount violate the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause by treating voters differently in different counties? The answer would determine the outcome of the election and the future of the country. On December 9th, the Supreme Court heard arguments in Bush versus Gore. The atmosphere was electric, with the justices acutely aware of the historic stakes. The court's decision would not only decide the presidency, but also test the limits of its own authority and legitimacy. 3 days later, on December 12th, the court delivered its decision, a ruling that would ignite firestorm of controversy. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that the Florida recount violated the Equal Protection Clause because it lacked uniform standards for evaluating ballots. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, effectively halted the recount, handing the presidency to George W. Bush. The decision was met with outrage and disbelief. Critics accused the court of overstepping its bounds and intervening in a political dispute. Justice John Paul Stevens, in a blistering dissent, warned that the ruling would undermine public confidence in the judiciary. Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, Stevens wrote, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. For Al Gore, the decision was a bitter pill to swallow. In a televised address, he conceded the election, urging the nation to unite behind its new president. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, Gore said, I accept it. The legacy of Bush versus Gore is complex and enduring. The case marked the first time the Supreme Court had directly intervened in a presidential election, raising questions about the role of the judiciary in political disputes. It also exposed flaws in the American electoral system, prompting calls for reform. But the case also underscored the importance of the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power. Despite the bitter divisions and legal battles, the election was resolved without violence or widespread unrest, a testament to the resilience of American democracy. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes, and the nation's collective anxiety would forever mark Bush versus Gore as one of the most consequential and controversial cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the wounds inflicted by the election be healed, and what would it take to ensure a fair and transparent electoral process for all? The answer would come at a tremendous cost, written in the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better future. Obergefell vs. Hodges, 2015, marriage equality. The year was 2015, and the United States was on the cusp of a historic moment in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights. For decades, same-sex couples had fought for the right to marry, facing discrimination, legal challenges, and societal prejudice. At the heart of this struggle was Jim Obergefell, a man whose love and determination would lead to one of the most transformative Supreme Court decisions in American history, Obergefell versus Hodges. Jim Obergefell's journey began in 2011 when he met John Arthur, the love of his life. The two men had been together for over 20 years, building a life filled with love and commitment. But when John was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, a progressive and fatal disease, their lives were turned upside down. Determined to have their relationship recognized before it was too late, Jim and John flew to Maryland, one of the few states where same-sex marriage was legal, and exchanged vows on the tarmac of a Baltimore airport. But when they returned to their home state of Ohio, their marriage was not recognized. Ohio's ban on same-sex marriage meant that Jim would not be listed as John's surviving spouse on his death certificate, a devastating blow to a couple who had already endured so much. Jim decided to fight back. With the help of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, he filed a lawsuit challenging Ohio's ban on same-sex marriage. His case was one of several that were consolidated into Obergefell versus Hodges, a landmark legal battle that would determine whether the Constitution guaranteed the right to marry for same-sex couples. As the case made its way to the Supreme Court, the nation watched with bated breath. The question before the justices was clear. Did the 14th Amendment require states to license marriages between two people of the same sex and to recognize such marriages performed in other states? The answer would have profound implications for the lives of millions of LGBTQ+ Americans and the future of civil rights in the United States. The Supreme Court heard arguments on April 28, 2015. The atmosphere was electric, with hundreds of supporters and opponents gathering outside the courthouse, waving signs and chanting slogans. Inside, the justices grappled with questions of love, equality, and the meaning of marriage. On June 26, 2015, the court delivered its decision, a ruling that would change the course of history. In a 5-4 decision, the court held that the 14th Amendment guarantees the right to marry for same-sex couples. Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for the majority, declared that marriage is a union unlike any other in its importance to the committed individuals. He emphasized that the right to marry is a fundamental liberty protected by the Constitution, and that denying that right to same-sex couples would demean and stigmatize their relationships. The decision was a watershed moment for LGBTQ+ rights. It struck down bans on same-sex marriage in the 13 states where they were still in effect, making marriage equality the law of the land. For Jim Obergefell, the ruling was a bittersweet victory. John had passed away in 2013, but his legacy lived on in the fight for equality. The legacy of Obergefell versus Hodges is profound and enduring. The case marked a historic step forward in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, affirming the dignity and equality of same-sex couples. It also underscored the power of the judiciary to protect individual rights and promote social progress. But the case also sparked fierce opposition, with critics arguing that it undermined traditional values and the role of states in defining marriage. In the years since Obergefell, the battle over LGBTQ rights has continued, with ongoing debates over religious freedom, anti-discrimination laws, and transgender rights. The suspense of that fateful ruling, the legal arguments, the personal stakes and the nation's collective anxiety would forever mark Obergefell versus Hodges as one of the most consequential and transformative cases in American history. And as the nation moved forward, the question lingered: how would the promise of equality be fulfilled? And what would it take to ensure justice and dignity for all? The answer would come at a tremendous cost, written in the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better future.